Good afternoon and welcome. Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a lively discussion on the recent collapse of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. Joining me today is former Ambassador of Israel to the United States and Ambassador-in-Residence at the Atlantic Council, the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, Michael Oren. I also have the great pleasure to welcome Sally Oren today. It was great to have you with us. And I'd also like to use this chance also to tip the hat to Adrian Arsht, founder of the Adrian Arsht Latin American Center, and really the person who inspired the whole idea of ambassadors in residence at the Atlantic Council, and is personally responsible for the fact that we have Michael Oren here now. So thank you very much, Adrian, for that. Ambassador Oren joined the Council in February. As I said in the announcement we made then and in the press release, he brings a powerful mixture of a historian's knowledge, a highest level diplomat's experience, and a best-selling author's writing skills. And he's helping to deepen our work and expertise on peace and security issues in the Middle East. Some of you who may be watching CNN during your work time hours may have just seen him a few minutes ago with Wolf Blitzer talking about some of the issues we'll talk about also here today. He's authored several books and many articles on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and American foreign policy in the region. His latest book, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, The United States in the Middle East, 1776 to 2006, is just a real terrific book. I was able to discuss it with him in his debut event here at the Atlantic Council. And any of you who missed it can go back to our website, atlanticcouncil.org, and find out what the civil wars, the U.S. civil wars impact on the cotton market has to do with Middle Eastern history. But it was an absolutely fascinating discussion. So Ambassador Oren, I'm very glad to have you back today. Now to the topic at hand. Almost 1 month ago, on April 29th, the most recent direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority collapsed. What began as a promising endeavor in July 2013 gradually deteriorated into a pattern, sadly a familiar pattern, of mistrust and reluctance to offer painful concessions. Today, Ambassador Oren will comment on what he believes went wrong and how, with strong U.S. commitment, Israel and the Palestinian Authority might be able to move back onto a path towards an eventual peace. We're always eager to encourage any of you to tweet. Today's hashtag is hashtag ACPeaceTalks, and you can follow the Scowcroft Center at AC Scowcroft. So with that, let me invite Ambassador Oren to the podium. He's going to give some opening comments, and then we'll engage in a discussion.
Fred.
Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be back. Great to be back at the Scowcroft Center. Thank you for listening all my my August accomplishments. Fred, you left out the most important one, which is the latest one, which is I am an expert diaperer of a new grandson. That one. That's my true accomplishment in life. Thanks to my wife, Sally, and our kid, our son, Yoav. Adrian, delightful to be here. Thank you for coming. Barry, everyone, all my friends. I basically know everybody in the room. So, Ziad, good to be here. So as Fred said before, I was a diplomat. I was an historian. So I'm going to take you back to some ancient history. Brace yourself. We are going to go back to the end of 2008. Very ancient history. I was in Washington. I was on sabbatical at Georgetown University with Professor Lieber here. And I had the opportunity at that time to discuss the Middle East policy of the incoming Obama administration, to actually sit with some members of this incoming administration, and to ask them, what is your game plan for the peace process? And they looked at me rather querulously and said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I mean that we have been at the Oslo peace process for about 15 years now, and so far without success. Now, for those of you who are new to this, to the lexicon, the Oslo Accords were signed not far from here on the White House lawn, September 1993, initialed by President Clinton, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. The Accords created a Palestinian Authority, but did not call for the time specifically for a two-state solution. Still, the general understanding was that the Palestinian Authority that was established by the Oslo Accords constituted an embryonic government for a future Palestinian state. And what can we say? Like all diplomatic documents, the Oslo Accords had some flaws. From my perspective, and there was an Israeli perspective, it included one central, ultimately fatal flaw. In those documents, Israel recognized the existence of a Palestinian people, but the Palestinians did not recognize the existence of a Jewish people, but it recognized the existence of the State of Israel. I'll unpack that further, why that was so problematic. In other words, one side recognized the right of self-determination of the other, but that recognition was not reciprocated. There was no recognition that there was a Jewish people endowed with the right of self-determination the way that the Palestinians had, and it became very, very problematic as the years passed. More problematically, again, from an Israeli perspective, the Palestinians did not forfeit what they regard as the right of Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to Israel. And just for the record, we're talking about many millions of people. And if they did return to pre-67 Israel, it would transform Israel into a de facto Palestinian state. It would retain the name Israel, but the majority of the population would be Palestinians. Now, these asymmetries came to the fore in the summer of 2000 at Camp David. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, now the president of the Palestinian Authority as well as the chairman of the PLO, was presented with an Israeli-American offer of Palestinian statehood in all of Gaza, half of Jerusalem, and over 90% of the West Bank. Territorially, this did not satisfy Arafat's demands, but it also required him to proclaim an end to the conflict, to disavow all further claims against Israel, and to concede the return of Palestinian refugees. And Arafat, who was the most powerful and most influential Palestinian leader, perhaps of all time, I think could have made peace at that time, but he walked away. And he walked away and instead engaged in terror, and we had the Second Intifada. Now, throughout the Oslo period, particularly in the 1990s, Israel's settler population in the West Bank grew. It virtually doubled during the course of the 1990s. And the world's accounting of the settler population was much higher than Israel's accounting of the population. For the world's accounting of the population included East Jerusalem, which was home to hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews, and in fact accounts for more than half of the Jewish population of Jerusalem. Israel never viewed East Jerusalem as a settlement. Israel annexed East Jerusalem shortly after its capture by Israeli forces in the summer of 1967, and since then Israel has regarded East Jerusalem as sovereign Israeli territory, does not regard the West Bank as sovereign Israeli territory. And then, if all this is not sufficiently complicated, there were the settlement blocks. Blocks are blocks of settlements. They account for about 80% of the settler population in the West Bank. They're adjacent to the 1967 lines. And it was Israel's longstanding assumption that these blocks, along with East Jerusalem, would be included under Israeli sovereignty in any future two-state deal with the Palestinians. Now, such a deal again became a possibility toward the end of 2008. This is after the end of the Second Intifada and the restoration of security and stability in both Israel and the West Bank. Even then, the situation was hardly propitious for a breakthrough toward peace. Arafat was gone. He was replaced by a lesser leader, Mahmoud Abbas. Gaza had been taken over by Hamas, which embraced terror and rejected Israel's existence and rejected all previous agreements between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. Arik Sharon, a powerful Israeli prime minister who perhaps could have made peace, lay in a coma at the end of 2008. And yet, against all odds, the Oslo formula produced another two-state offer. It was put on the table by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and it proved to be even more conciliatory to the Palestinians than that which had been preferred at Camp David. But it, too, stipulated an end to all claims, an end of conflict, and reportedly Palestinian recognition of Israel as the Jewish state. And Mahmoud Abbas, like Arafat before him, walked away from this offer. Now, a few weeks later came my meeting with the members of the incoming administration, and so I asked them, so, what's next? Where do we go from here? Perhaps, I suggested, it's time to look for new formulas, for new approaches. Perhaps a permanent two-state solution requires both sides to make concessions that neither can actually make. Why then don't we see agreements that the two sides can make? Instead of beating our heads against the Oslo wall, why don't we work seriously for less than comprehensive solutions which are possible and which materially enhance and improve the lives of Palestinians and Israelis on the ground? But the answer I received was not particularly encouraging. Any future Obama administration, I was told, would try to advance the Oslo process and bring it to its two-state conclusion. And with that, the conversation ended. What happened over the next 5 years can best be described as beating our heads against the Oslo wall, and the wall, not entirely surprisingly, tragically, won. Though some progress was reportedly made in the recent rounds of talks, the process failed to achieve a two-state solution. In fact, it fell far short of the process's high watermarks in 2000 and 2008. Think about this. Back then, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators met pretty openly and pretty frequently. And today, they're not meeting officially at all. Once engaged with a bitter civil strife with Hamas in Gaza, the Al-Fatah party in the West Bank of the Palestinian Authority is today reconciling with Hamas. From a willingness to negotiate without preconditions, the Palestinians today will only agree to negotiate once conditions are met. And while the Oslo process was once the only diplomatic game in town, the Palestinians are now pursuing different unilateral paths to statehood without giving peace through the United Nations and international bodies. Rather than reining in or even circumscribing Israeli settlement building, the Israeli population beyond the 1967 lines continues to grow. Now, the Obama administration comes into the White House in the early 2009, claiming that the previous Bush administration had not done enough to achieve peace. But let's remember, Bush's Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, made 23 trips to Israel and the West Bank over a 2-year period, and she actually produced a formula for a two-state solution. Secretary of State John Kerry has come 11 times, and he's conducted numerous video conferences with regional leaders, but he's yet to table even a non-binding framework agreement. It's not equaling what happened in 2008. So I think you can say this is less of a peace process than it is a peace digression. The press, meanwhile, has been rife with accusations about which side bears the greatest responsibility for this very sad situation. The Israelis have accused the Palestinians of negotiating in bad faith, of planning in advance to reconcile with Hamas, to pocket Israeli concessions, and then to bolt to the UN to declare statehood unilaterally. American and Palestinian sources, for the most part, have pointed fingers at Israel's continued settlement activity as the principal reason for the breakdown of talks. It is indeed hard to conceive how building settlements in areas slated for Palestinian sovereignty in any way advances the peace process. On the other hand, settlements which did not impede the tabling of the 2000 and 2008 two-state solution proposals, those settlements became much more of an impediment to the peace process because of several policy decisions that were taken early in 2009. The first of these was the administration's refusal to acknowledge the existence, much less the validity, of the 2004 letter from President Bush to Arik Sharon. Now, that letter recognized what most Israelis thought was obvious, that the long-established Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, as well as the settlement blocks adjacent to the 1967 lines, all of that would be included within Israel in the event of the creation of a two-state solution. Disavowing that letter became very problematic. It erased the distinction between Israeli constructions in the blocks, and particularly in East Jerusalem, and Israeli construction in those areas that would be slated for Palestinian statehood. And that disavowal created further problems. Excuse me. No Israeli government right, left, up, or down, could cease building in Jerusalem neighborhoods that had been Jewish neighborhoods for over 40 years, irrespective of who was in government in Israel. Sally and I and our kids had an apartment in South Jerusalem. It's not just East Jerusalem is not just South Jerusalem, it's also Northwest and South Jerusalem, but in an area that had always been part of Israel, even before 1967, but we were right across the street from a very large neighborhood known as Gilo. And we were on the other side of another very large Jewish neighborhood known as East Talpiot. Both were built over the 1967 lines, but I would be very surprised if any of our kids ever thought of either of those neighborhoods as settlements. It would be complete, nobody even knows what those lines are in Jerusalem today. So equating the building in Jerusalem with outlying settlements, say in Samaria, Yizhar, and Elomoreh, created a very difficult situation, greatly constricted the latitude of any Israeli government, but also constricted the latitude of Palestinian decision makers. Palestinian leaders could not be less Palestinian than the United States. And by calling for a settlement freeze, they had to mean all of the settlements in the blocks and in East Jerusalem, because that's what the United States demanded. Palestinians couldn't demand anything less. Real problem. So there was never an agreement about what actually constituted a settlement and what would constitute a freeze. And what this did, it effectively enabled opponents of the process to stop the process whenever they wanted to by announcing the intended instruction of a couple of hundred units in, say, Gilo or East Talpiot, because then it becomes a settlement movement, construction of the settlement stops the process dead. It put a tool in their hand. So Israeli building outside of the settlement blocks, as I said, was unhelpful, but the vast majority of the construction was actually in the blocks, and that was also depicted as settlement building. Now, of course, it's very easy to point fingers today. It's very easy to engage in Monday morning quarterbacking. Try translating that expression into Hebrew and Arabic. Monday morning quarterbacking. Very easy to speculate what might have been, and it's certainly easy to spend hours, and Fred won't like this, talking about the internal political dynamics within Israel and within the Palestinian camp that militated against the successful process. And it's easy to talk about the absence of trust between all sides. Palestinians for Israelis, Israelis for Palestinians, Palestinians and Israelis for the United States. Not much trust there. Such trust was the fundamental fiber that holds this process together. It wasn't there. At the end of the day, we're still left. We're still left with a very unsatisfactory situation. And I'm left with the same question that I asked back in 2008. What kind of agreement can be achieved? And to answer that question, we must first understand more specifically what cannot be achieved. Israel cannot return to the 1967 lines. Those lines were at their narrowest 9 miles wide. It was actually at Israel's most populous bottleneck. Those lines excluded half of Jerusalem. They excluded the holiest sites in Jerusalem. And today those lines, all right, 45 years later, those lines overlook the major highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and they're very close to Israel's major airport. So from a security perspective, very, very problematic. Ostensibly, the problem would be addressed by mutually agreed swaps. But by modest accounts, the Israelis would need between 6 and 10% of the West Bank to keep a viable swap of territory, in order to keep also most of the settlers within Israel's borders. There's also the question of the nature of the swaps. Could, for example, Israel swap areas that contain large numbers of Israeli Arabs, as some Israeli politicians have suggested? Would that be acceptable to the other side? Having endured the trauma of the Gaza disengagement in 2005, Israeli society remained bitterly opposed to uprooting tens of thousands of settlers from the West Bank. And let us be clear about this, folks. Even a middle-sized settlement in the West Bank has more inhabitants than the entire 21 settlements that were uprooted from Gaza. I'll give you an example of scale. And then we come to the security issues. Now, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000, from Gaza, as I said, in 2005. Both areas were taken over by Iranian-backed terrorists at the time, who proceeded to fire thousands of rockets into Israel. Israel's problem was not Gaza's border with Israel, but the problem was Gaza's border with Egypt. Israel's problem with southern Lebanon was not Israel's border with southern Lebanon, but Lebanon's border with Syria. And whether it was the Egyptian border or the Syrian border, those borders proved to be very porous for the smuggling of thousands of rockets into these areas that were later fired at Israeli cities. So to prevent the West Bank from becoming another southern Lebanon or another Gaza, Israel would have to maintain a long-term military presence along the West Bank-Jordan border, which is the Jordan Valley. That military presence, the need for that presence, was greatly augmented by the events that began in 2011, the upheaval that swept the Arab world. And in that tumultuous Arab world, a one-party, unelected, avowedly secular, and far from corruption-free government, such as the Palestinian Authority, did not enjoy particularly great longevity. So you had to account for the possibility that you would create a two-state situation, but the Palestinian government would disintegrate. And then how do you ensure Israeli security after that? So the question of the Jordan Valley presence became very acute. Lastly, most fundamentally from the Israeli side, there was need for recognition of Israel as the Jewish state. This is a long-standing now condition. It's not a precondition for negotiations, but it is a condition for a two-stage solution. And there's much misunderstanding about it. You got to think about Jewish state as a code. Again, just as Israel recognizes the Palestinians as a people endowed with self-determination, need that to be reciprocated. That is the only way you have a durable and legitimate peace. It's not a transient peace. You can't have a peace where one side's legitimate and the other side's illegitimate and transient. Jewish state means that the Palestinians have to disavow any further claims. They have to say that the conflict has actually ended. You're going to make peace, but it really means peace. Jewish state means that the Palestinians have to agree that the Palestinian refugees and their millions of descendants will be repatriated to the Palestinian state and not to Israel in the event that the Palestinian state is created. Israelis intrinsically understand the need for recognition of a Jewish state. It's not very well understood here, but Israelis get it. Recent polls show about 80% of the Israeli population would require that recognition in order to approve any two-state solution. Now, none of these requirements are easily acceptable to the Palestinians. Palestinian negotiators want to begin negotiating from the 1967 borders with very minimal swaps. The most I've heard is 1.9%, but it goes down much, much further from that. So there's no agreement about the size of the swaps and also the content of the swaps. The Palestinians want a state that is devoid of Jewish inhabitants, but the swaps are also devoid of Israeli Arab inhabitants. So there's no agreement about what the swap would be. They have not agreed to a prolonged Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley. Mahmoud Abbas gave a speech in the UN where he intimated that he would consider it an end of claims or end of conflict. But I've seen no willingness to give up what the Palestinians call the right of return for the refugees. And they will not recognize Israel as the Jewish state. Doing so, and I've heard Palestinian negotiations say this, means giving up their identity. It goes to a very, very core issue. Israel has to make huge sacrifices for peace, has to take a lot of risk, but we don't have to give up our identity. We wake up in the morning, we don't say we're Jewish or Israeli because we're not Palestinian. For the Palestinians, the negation of the Zionist Jewish narrative is very, very central to their identity. And I think they're telling the truth. When Palestinian negotiator says, you're asking me to give up who I am, I think that's what they're talking about. And this is a very, very steep price to pay, and I have very grave doubts whether the Palestinians will be willing to pay it. I still believe that if Arafat had signed on the dotted line in 2000, if Mahmoud Abbas had signed on the dotted line in 2008, and those agreements had gone to a national referendum in Israel, they would have passed. They would have passed. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced that the Palestinian negotiating team and Palestinian leaders, though they may be willing, I don't know if they're still capable of making those type of sacrifices, particularly the sacrifices of who they are. Keep in mind that the president of the Palestinian Authority is also the chairman of the PLO. He represents not only the Palestinians in the West Bank, he represents all of the Palestinians. He has to think about his entire constituency and not just his limited West Bank constituency. So many of you have undoubtedly heard it said that people basically understand the contours of this agreement. All right? Everyone pretty much knows what the agreement was going to look like. But the fact of the matter is, there is no agreement on what the final agreement would look like. And friends, I have not even begun to touch Jerusalem. This is all outside of Jerusalem. There's no agreement. So the question again arises, where do we go from here? And the answer is surprising. The answer is we can go many places, and with potentially very positive results. Here again, history helps. Look at the state of Palestinian-Israeli relations in 1993, those of us old enough to remember. Look at the state of Israeli-Palestinian relations in 2003, at the height of the Second Intifada, and look where those relations are today. Today, there is greater commercial cooperation, there is cooperation on water, there's cooperation on tourism, there is cooperation on trade. We don't even want to go into it, just how much cooperation there is on trade. And all of that has had a positive impact on the ground. In contrast to the moribund peace process, a de facto Palestinian sovereignty is emerging in large areas of the West Bank, in the Ramallah area, in Nablus. And there we see impressive economic growth, and you will not find a single Israeli soldier patrolling the streets of downtown Ramallah. There is a need, and beyond that, there is an opportunity to build and strengthen these trends, and to perhaps ground them in a new diplomatic reality. How can that happen? You can, I think, accurately ask, how can it happen if Israel is still building settlements? How can it happen if the Palestinians are reconciling with Hamas and going to the UN? How can all that happen? And yet I tend to look at these challenges as opportunities. I actually see that these seemingly problematic trends can actually create a momentum to something akin to a diplomatic breakthrough. Now, before becoming ambassador, and now that I've concluded my term, I have advocated for what I've called Plan B. Plan B is an initiative designed to ensure Israel's democratic and Jewish integrity. It will enable Israel to defend itself, all the while keeping the door open to a more permanent negotiated solution. This is how it works. If and when the Palestinians declare a state at the UN, and they will define it according to the 1967 lines, Israel will then declare its own borders. These borders will not conform to the separation barrier. They will not conform to the breakdown of the West Bank under Oslo into areas A, B, and C. Rather, those borders will follow demographic lines. They will seek to include the maximum number of Israelis within Israel's borders and the minimum number of Palestinians. They will ensure a unified Jerusalem and include Jewish holy places, which is important for Israeli constituencies. But most vitally for Israel, it will maintain Israel's deployment in the Jordan Valley and other strategic sites, and it will also preserve Israel's latitude of action. Now, borders such as these can be drawn while maintaining contiguous Palestinian control over those areas where the vast majority of West Bank Palestinians lead. It requires some creativity, but it can be drawn. In short, Plan B ends what the Palestinians and what most of the world call the occupation. Though it will certainly not eliminate the threat of sanctions from Israel, it will, I believe, greatly reduce them. And it will not remove the threat of terrorism. No solution can. There's no threat-free solution here. It will provide Israel with the means to continue to defend itself. This is not, I stress, this is not disengagement from Gaza redux. It will be clear, Israel's not going back to the 67 lines. Israel will not give up its military prerogatives and its assets. Israel will keep control of the airspace and uphold the right of hot pursuit, which it preserves today. And then there are the settlements. In Gaza, I said earlier, we uprooted all of the settlements. But in Plan B, the borders will be drawn in such a way as to encompass the great majority of the settlements, and it will enable the relocation of a select few settlements. Under Plan B, again, Israel will preserve its Jewish majority and safeguard its majority. And let's be clear about this. Plan B will not be to the liking of the Palestinians, which I, again, see as a positive factor. Because only if the Palestinians dislike Plan B will they have an incentive to come back to the negotiating table, and the door will be kept open. Come back to the negotiating table without preconditions, and negotiate a permanent solution, which will be more to their liking. I stress, a two-state negotiated solution is the preferable course. but it may take years to accomplish that. It may take generations to accomplish that. How long did it take for the relationship, for the thought of war between Germany and France to become totally unthinkable, much less the possibility of war between France and Great Britain, which was a reality for centuries? It may take us a long time to get there. In the interim, though, we can create a situation in which two states have a border dispute. And it's only one of many dozens of border disputes in the world today. There are border disputes between China and Russia, China and India, Britain and Spain, and though many people are unaware of it, there are a number of border disputes between the United States and Canada, even to this day. And just like the British and the Spanish, and the Americans and the Canadians, Israelis and Palestinians can live secure and prosperous lives while they learn to coexist. Clearly, a fundamental factor in guaranteeing Plan B success is support from foreign governments, above all from the United States. For the past few years, the Obama administration has been warning the people of Israel about the dangers of not reaching a two-state solution, of international sanctions and isolation, of Israel becoming an apartheid state. Those predictions could become self-fulfilling. Similarly, Washington has suggested that Israelis have too much security, too much prosperity to understand the urgent need to make peace. History, in fact, tells a different story. During the darkest periods of that second intifada, there was close to no public support for a two-state solution. Today, after the restoration of security, there is a very significant majority in favor of a two-state solution. And history shows that Israelis make concessions not when they feel threatened. Israelis make concessions when they feel secure and when they feel that the United States is solidly behind them. Here, then, is another opportunity. The United States can encourage Israelis to take the bold steps necessary to ensure Israel's future as a secure Jewish and democratic state by supporting Plan B. And by supporting Plan B, the United States can send a signal to the world that Israel will not stand alone, it won't be vulnerable to boycotts and embargoes, it will not be isolated. Now, such a policy probably is not going to culminate in a White House signing. It's not going to generate a lot of international peace process. But such a policy, I believe, stands a very good chance of improving the lives of millions of Palestinians and Israelis on the ground. It will improve our lives while opening a pathway to a permanent and a genuine peace. Thank you. This says Kemp. I could be a Kempt man. Could be good.
Or unkempt.
I knew you'd appreciate it.
Was that joke on the record? Right. Thanks for that very
lengthy,
provocative plan and those comments. Let's drill down on Plan B. Mm-hmm. First of all, you probably have to come up with a better title for it than Plan B. But
I've been told. But it's one of the things that stuck, Fred.
Yeah.
I try to come up with a couple of things. I do a lot of media in Israel, and every time I go on the TV and I try to talk at some kind of creative initiative, unilateral. The word unilateralism is verboten now. You can't use the word unilateralism because of Gaza. But I try to talk about it, and they said, "Oh, let's talk about Plan B." Plan B is now Plan B. And that's it. We're stuck with it.
So what level of interest do you find in the Obama administration for something like a Plan B? Or where do you think the thinking is right now? And as you said, when you first mentioned this, I think in late February, your Plan B was when we first heard about it, right? Including then a unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank as part of that as well, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing is, what kind of traction do you think this could get in the Obama administration, or already has or could get? And then the other thing, you mentioned Gaza. Could it have the same destiny as the bitter experiences that accompanied Gaza disengagement?
They're two very different questions. With the administration, I've been in, and I'm talking to a great number of people from different parts of the administration. What can I say? They're interested in listening. Yeah. I think they're also taking notice that this is a discussion that is gaining great traction in Israel. Israeli leaders from different parts of the political spectrum have come out and acknowledged that this is probably the way we're going to have to go. And there's a debate now about where the actual border is. Some of you may have read the Wall Street Journal article 2 days ago by Naftali Bennett, the economics minister. He comes from the right-wing, how do you translate that, Dan? The Jewish Home Party. He talks about annexing parts of Plan C and giving Palestinians autonomy in areas A and B. All right, you'd say that is the fact. There are parts of that that are very problematic. I think it's odd that a party that refutes the Oslo Accords is adopting the lexicon of Oslo of A, B, and C. It also it reveals a type of symmetry between the Israeli right and the Israeli left in denying the Palestinians agency. They assume the Palestinians are just going to be passive and just sit around and let them get autonomy in the West Bank. No, the Palestinians are going to take their destiny in their own hand. They're going to go to the UN. So that's not going to happen. But what's interesting here is that here is the leader of the settlement movement who's saying, we're going to give up part of the West Bank. That's a revolutionary statement. And then we're just talking about where the border goes. There are people on the Israeli left who are saying the border is going to be minimal. It's going to be close to where the separation fence is now. So now we're having a discussion in Israel. And I think that to go back to the question is that there are people in the American foreign policy world who are taking note of the discussion and are interested about it. Because it is certainly better than a situation where the Palestinians declare a state unilaterally and then try to take us to some type of international court and cast us as illegal occupiers of a member state of the UN and try to sanction us. Your second question, if I remember it, was, what's your second question?
The second question was how does it avoid the same destiny as the Gaza disengagement?
Well, I think I stressed several times that we're not. This isn't Gaza redux. We're not going back to 67 borders. Gaza went back to 67 borders. Gaza uprooted all the Israeli settlements. We're not talking about uprooting any Israeli settlements. I do talk about relocating some of them, which in some cases could be down the road. Depends where the border is. I think most importantly, in Gaza, we gave up so much of our military assets and prerogatives, particularly the border. We gave up that crucial border between Gaza and Egypt, which proved so disastrous for everybody. And I don't think that's going to happen. But I will stress, as I intimated in my talks, there is no solution, even a two-state solution, that is risk-free. Of course there's risk, and particularly in an area where, and I'll say this again, where governments like the PA have not fared well in the Middle East of the last 3 years. And you have to prepare for the possibility that any future Palestinian government could not, would encounter the type of Arab Spring upheaval that has hit a number of Israeli Arab states.
So let me go to what Minister Bennett wrote, and I'll ask one or two questions, and I'll go to the audience. And I also think, just for the good of our web audience, et cetera, that we'll put together some of your ideas on Plan B and in sort of bullet form on the website. So tomorrow or the next day we'll have a good outline of this, because I do find it fascinating. He wrote in his op-ed that Israel should, you mentioned some of this, but should dismantle the security barrier in the West Bank, let most Palestinians who live there should govern themselves. So that's
the autonomy part.
That's the autonomy part. Expect for the so-called, what they called Area C, which includes Eastern Jerusalem and Israeli settlements, West Bank. In fact, he favored those territories' annexation, I think, in the piece.
Right.
Is this a feasible option? And then in what parts of it details or its intent do you think it differs from Plan B?
I think there are parts of Area C that have large Palestinian populations as well. I think that by remaining attached to the taxonomy, the lexicon of Oslo, of A, B, and C, we do both ourselves a disservice and the Palestinians a disservice. I think we should look at where the populations actually are concentrated, and that is where the border should go. And if the goal is to end Israeli control over Palestinian populations, then dividing it by A, B, and C is not necessarily going to help you. You want to be able to look at actually the map and see where the populations are. There are other factors that have to be taken into account, security, certain very important sites and capabilities, but that should be the governing factor. And there I would disagree with Naftali Bennett. I also I have a fundamental disagreement in the sense that he thinks what you understand from that article, he thinks that the Palestinians are going to accept this rather passively, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think they do have agency, and they are going to move in a very activist way. They have been. One of the criticisms I've spoken about frequently in the Israeli press is that the Palestinians they maintain an initiative, and Israel keeps on reacting to the initiative, but we don't take any initiatives of our own. And I say that's it's not a good negotiating position. It's also, in terms of our own Zionist ideology, not very Zionist.
Well, let's talk about the Palestinians a bit. I mean, clearly, the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation has been a big part of this story. What impact will that have on Abbas negotiations with Israel? And also, given the bitter history of Fatah and Hamas, what do you think drove the reconciliation? And are they going to be able to reach an even more lasting agreement? Where does it go?
Well, by my count, this is the fourth time they've tried it. The three previous have failed. There are fundamental disagreements. There's a lot of bad blood. There was an interesting article, I think, in the New York Times yesterday about some of the bad blood. Mahmoud Abbas will try to present a unified government that's run by technocrats. And behind the technocrats, that technocratic facade will hide a reality in which one part of the Palestinian camp recognizes Israel's right to exist, accepts previous agreements between the PA and Israel, and disavows terror, and the other side doesn't. That's Hamas. To this day, they completely refute the three conditions established by the quartet. And there will be members of the quartet that will accept that. The Europeans have intimated that that's acceptable to them. The United States has intimated that it's less acceptable to the United States, and to Israel it's completely unacceptable. Netanyahu has said repeatedly he's not going to interact with a technocratic government that serves as that type of facade. In pure diplomatic terms, it's a very useful move for Mahmoud Abbas, and this is underestimated. In international law, one of the primary criteria for sovereignty is control over all the population all over the territory. In the past, Mahmoud Abbas has not been able to claim that he controls all the territory or all the population because of Gaza, which was under Hamas. Now, ostensibly, he can go to the UN in the fall and say, look, I control all the population. I control all of the territory, and my claim for sovereignty, I'm de facto sovereign right now. And to my mind, that greatly enhances his ability to gain statehood status in the UN.
Interesting. Thank you. Questions, comments, please. And Robert, if you can identify yourself and we, even though this session is on the peace talks and the Palestinian-Israeli situation, your questions can go far afield from that if you'd like. Lots of other issues you can address.
Two questions about Plan B. One, the Israeli Arab novelist Saeed Kashua wrote a very provocative novel some years ago, which features, among other things, a sudden decision to hand over the triangle to the Palestinian Authority as part of a peace agreement. Right. Does the Palestinian Triangle at all figure into the Plan B? And second, what about the Israeli security presence along or near the Jordan River and in the hills abutting that?
No. The answer first, Bob, is that the triangle or other swaps do not figure into it. You can revisit the swap issue at such a time in the future if and when the sides want to avail themselves of the open door, or go through the open door and talk about swapping territory. And then we'll have to address that. And it's a very sensitive and complex issue because the Palestinian position right now is that Israel would get populated areas that are populated by Israeli Jews, but they would get back in return unpopulated areas. And then you get into the quality of the areas. Is Israel going to be getting cultivable land and giving back desert? There are all these issues. So it's not just the quantity and the inhabitants of any territory, it's also the quality of those territories. And there's no agreement on these. But again, we're leaving that for a later stage. As for the Jordan Valley, Plan B assumes a continued Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley and also Israeli military control over very essential sites. Some of them are on elevated sites.
Since we went back to Plan B, what are the other options other than Plan B? You know, if you're sitting and you're John Kerry and Secretary of State, and it was interesting the comment you made about Condoleezza Rice. I think we sort of forget how often she was there and how far she went because we've been focusing so much on Secretary Kerry and his engagement. But if you're in his position and you see Plan B as one option, what are your other options?
I don't think there aren't any. There aren't many. What's one option? That option is Palestinians go to the UN, declare a state, declare Israel basically in violation of international law, and there's the possibility of sanctions, embargoes, and that somehow weakens Israel to the point where it accepts positions that are more amenable to the Palestinians. That is one scenario, and there's no one can tell you right now whether that's going to happen, A, whether there will be sanctions, B, whether Israel will buckle to them. The other scenario is the status quo, which I don't think is acceptable to just about anybody, and or an outbreak of violence. You can't rule it out. I think it is unlikely. That's my personal opinion. It's not the personal opinion of all observers, but you can't rule that out either. And I think Plan B not only makes sense from an Israeli point of view, it actually makes sense from a negotiated point of view. Why? Right now, think about Israelis and Palestinians are at the table. They're not at the table. Let's imagine they're at the table. Palestinians have put Plan B, their Plan B on the table. Their Plan B is to go to the UN. Israel has just sat at the table, hasn't tabled any alternatives. It's not said to the Palestinians, if you do this, I'm going to do that. The most they've said is we're going to cut off taxes or something like this, or cut off various supplies. But it's all punitive and reactive. Instead, Israel should put its Plan B on the table, where the Palestinians can see it, saying, if you're going to do this, we're going to do that. And therefore, the two Plan Bs on the table actually enhance the possibility that people will go to Plan A, which is the two-state solution. And this is negotiations 101. I'm not reinventing the negotiating wheel here. That hasn't happened. And for reasons that I think I outlined in my talk, I don't think Plan A is a particularly realistic plan right now because it's asking the two sides to make concessions which they can't make. Maybe they'll be able to make it in years to come and in generations to come, but right now it's very, very difficult. There was a time when Alsace was impossible to resolve, and who thinks about it today? Someday we'll have a reality where we'll think back and think, oh God, this was silly. We were arguing about 2 miles from Israel's airport. Who cares? It's a different situation. Right now it's impossible, but it's important that they know that there's a Plan B that we have too. And if it comes down to it, then we have it won't be a two-state solution, but it'll be a two-state situation in which there is a border dispute. And the preference will be for that border dispute to be, it won't be a violent border dispute. Most border disputes in the world are not violent. The British are not firing cannons at the Spanish over Gibraltar, but they have a dispute. And there are ways of adjudicating those disputes, and there's ways of working around disputes. The Chinese and the Russians and the Indians all have border disputes, and they're not firing over those borders right now. And while we have that dispute, then the processes which I see going on in the field right now will continue. How many years ago? Wasn't that years ago when it was illegal? It was illegal for an Israeli to travel to Ramallah. It was illegal for an Israeli to travel to Bethlehem. It's not the case now. There's lots of back and forth, and it's going to get more and more. And I see that's very positive.
So, interesting phrase, a two-state situation in which there is a border dispute. I have to hold on to that one. But I want to go back to the questions, but what this suggests, as you were talking about the options, one of the options you didn't talk about was resume negotiations. So this is negotiations without negotiations. This is basically two people putting it aside. So you think at this point that there's not a resumed negotiations, let alone what some people are suggesting, which is the U.S. should be more directly involved?
I think that there's always going to be a role for the United States. There's no substitution for the last night. The last time I spoke here, we talked about supposedly the waning of American influence and power in the Middle East, and I said then, and I'll reiterate today, that there's no substitute for American mediation. There are midway points. I don't want to go into too much detail here because it hasn't been fleshed out completely of some type of coordinated Plan Bs, but that may be very wishful thinking, that we can actually talk about ways that we can coordinate the emergence of a two-state situation in a way that is less combustible and more creative. But that may be wishful thinking. I'll leave it at that, Fred, before I get in trouble.
Yeah. Go continue. Yeah, please. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Nathan Sachs from Brookings. Ambassador, thanks for the
Hi.
talk. Hi. I wanted to ask on the issue you left out, which is Jerusalem. The great appeal of the Plan B and the power of it is that you're leaving the door open for future years or generations to come back. But in Jerusalem, things are not static. And for many Palestinians, that's the crux of it. It may be within the Bush lines, but it's not for Palestinians. So how is the door left open for the possibility of resolution in the future on Jerusalem, the hardest issue, which was combustible in the past too?
Well, I think that I strongly felt, and I think that there were people in the Israeli government, I can't speak for that government, but agreed with me, that with the notion that Jerusalem should never again be divided, and that there were creative solutions for Jerusalem that could be achieved given the presence of a lot of goodwill. And the possibility for those creative solutions would remain. And you probably know what I'm talking about. But not redividing the city. I don't think that's good for the city. I don't think it's good for the Palestinians or Israelis. And that possibly, again, the door will be open to that.
Questions, comments? Let me take a look at the regional situation and how it affects this situation. Things don't remain static, and situations. The situation 4 or 5 years from now, 2 or 3 years from now, either will be better for a two-state solution or the stabilization of a two-state situation, or worse. You're looking at a situation in Syria that seems to be going from bad to worse. You're looking at a situation in Iran where the administration is trying to reach a negotiated solution there. How does that, first, where do you see the regional situation standing at the moment? And then what impact does it have on everything we've been talking about today?
Well, the regional situation is a sort of a two-edged sword in terms of the peace process. Let's anchor it in the peace process. On one hand, people, particularly Israelis, will look at the turmoil engulfing the region and saying, why should we give up concrete assets to a one-party, unelected, far from corruption-free, unstable leadership that could disintegrate tomorrow? And then we have Syria, not just beyond the Golan Heights. We have Syria a half an hour from Greater Tel Aviv. And that is a very compelling argument. The other side of the argument is that is because of the great turmoil in the Middle East, let us try to stabilize the one area where we actually can stabilize. Because Israel, or nobody else, can actually impact the internal situation in Syria. We can't bring greater stability and democracy to Egypt. There's many areas that the United States, Israel, and other countries cannot impact internally. The one place where we actually can move is on the Palestinian front. Now, have we been able to move to the two-state solution? We haven't, but I want to sound like I'm harping on this. I think we can move in different directions that can improve the lives there. I think Palestinians look around the Middle East and they say, I don't want to go there. I don't want Syria here. I don't want Egypt here. And that, in a way, becomes more of an incentive for coexistence than the opposite. I don't think anybody's longing for, not many people are longing for a third intifada. And for the return of violence and upheaval in the West Bank or in Gaza. Again, a two-edged sword. On one hand, it creates anxiety, uncertainty, and reticence. On the other hand, it creates a desire to deepen the stability and prosperity that is already occurring. And I hope that doesn't sound Pollyannish, but it does? Pollyannish? Does, good. I'm glad you think so, good.
Please.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks.
Thank you. Manar Ghonaim, Middle East News Agency, Egypt. Mr. Ambassador, let me just represent for you the Arab point of view regarding the Plan B, which Mr. Kempf described it as a provocative plan so far. First of all, I want to know, does Israel has presented this Plan B to the United States or
No.
to the international? Okay, so do you think if it is presented, it will be acceptable by the European community, by the United States, by the international community in general? Because you see, you have just said some statements that maybe provoke the what's called the Arab Peace Initiative, you see. For example, you have said that no Israeli government can seize building in East Jerusalem. You have just also said that Israel cannot return back to 1967 lines, you see. All these are denying the Arab Peace Initiative principles, you see. So how could you explain if Israel presented to the international community? Thank you.
Good question. Let me be more specific.
And let me also say, when I was saying provocative, I meant more thought-provoking.
It's okay. I like her provocative, too. I like provocative. Provocative is a good thing. To the best of my knowledge, because I'm not in government anymore, this hasn't been discussed, to the best of my knowledge. So I said no, it's a qualified no. Yes, it is provocative. And for the record, the Arab Peace Initiative is an important component of the peace process. It actually has been acknowledged as such by the Israeli government. There are parts of the Arab peace process which are problematic from the point of Israel, particularly relating to the 67 borders and to the refugee issue. The return to the 67 borders is long-standing Israeli policy that goes back to 1967. There's never been an Israeli government, left, right, up or down, that has said we're going to go back to 67 borders, because they're very, very problematic. I mean, 67 borders is the Western Wall. 67 borders is today central Israel. There has never been an Israeli government that says we're going to hold back on building in East Jerusalem or South Jerusalem or Northwest Jerusalem what is over the 1949 armistice line, because that area constitutes sovereign Israel by law. The Prime Minister of Israel has no more authority to stop a building project in East Jerusalem than the President of the United States has to stop a building project in Pittsburgh. Doesn't. It's beyond his capacity. It would go to the Supreme Court, and the Prime Minister would lose. It's against the law. And that's important to internalize. So the request that Israel stops building in East Jerusalem is an impossible request. It's impossible in terms of public opinion because nobody understands it, but it's also impossible legally. As a distinction from the West Bank, which is not sovereign. Israel never annexed the West Bank. So it's a different situation there. Now go to your heart of your question. To what degree could this ever be acceptable to the international community? And I'm proceeding under the assumption that it's not going to be. I'm going to proceed on the assumption that that there will be significant parts of what you call the international community, and sometimes the international community only exists on one issue, and that's our issue. It doesn't exist on Ukraine, it doesn't exist on a lot of issues, but it exists on our issue, is that part of it will say Israel's not going back to 67 border, it's not creating a sufficiently contiguous Palestinian state. I think that you can get a contiguous Palestinian state, but it involves creative solutions, overpasses and tunnels, which not everybody likes. But as I said in my remarks, there's a big difference between being unacceptable to the international community and being the object of boycotts and sanctions from the international community. And I believe that if we can go to this entity known as the international community and say, look, we are no longer occupying the Palestinian population. We're not giving them everything they wanted territorially, but we're no longer, the occupation is what you care about, here we're ending it. That will reduce our vulnerability on that level. That's my feeling. There's a big question, the degree to which this would be acceptable to the United States. And I think American support here is absolutely crucial because to use another term that you couldn't translate into Hebrew and Arabic, having the United States run interference for us on this would be very important. And it's a subject of discussion. That's all I'll say. It's a discussion of discussion. And I think, as I said earlier, people here in Washington are watching with interest the discussion that is occurring across the Israeli political spectrum on the right and left about ways that we can take our destiny in our own hands and not outsource our fundamental future to Palestinian decision-making, which is the situation that exists right now.
Okay, thank you. Please.
My name is Richard Corris. I've been listening to these peace discussions for as long as I can remember, and they seem to be no closer to any kind of success now than when I first started hearing about them. I've unfortunately concluded that they're probably never going to succeed. If they never succeed, do you think what should, and unfortunately Israel is probably never going to be a secure and permanent Jewish homeland. What other alternatives can you think of to find a secure and permanent Jewish future somewhere? Like, I know while these discussions have been going on, over 2 million Israeli Jews have moved here to the United States and established themselves as a very successful and prosperous community. Do you think their future might be more here in North America than in the Middle East?
Speaking of provocative questions.
That's a provocative question. I'm going to beg to differ with just about every point you made, other than the fact that you've probably sat here for many years listening to peace discussions. I take the long view. Again, history really helps. History is the great salve. I look at where Arab-Israel relations were either in 1948 or 56 and 67. I see where they are today, and we're a very different place. I was part of a generation where if you suggested that there should be a Palestinian state created, most Israelis would have said it's an existential threat to Israel. Today, almost by the same majority, Israelis think that the creation of a Palestinian state is the way to ensure Israel's survival, not to end Israel's survival. I mentioned comparing even 1993 to today, or 2003 to today. And if you take the long view, to my mind, that long view often leads to optimism. And I don't think it's Pollyannish optimism. I can actually point to improvements that have been made on the ground. Israel recognizes, in my generation, we had a prime minister named Golda Meir says there's no Palestinian people. Today, the official position of the state of Israel is that there is a Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people is endowed with the right to self-determination. You got the head of the Likud party. Who would have thought this? Who was in favor of a two-state solution. As I mentioned earlier, you got the head of the most right-wing party in Israel who's calling for giving up parts of the land of Israel. All that is a lot of movement. Maybe it's not a solution, and maybe looking for a solution, certainly a solution now, maybe that's Pollyannish, maybe that's unrealistic, may take generations. But I think much can be done. And diplomacy is the art of the possible. I think there's a lot of possibilities here. As for your last comment about Israelis moving here, there is not, to my knowledge, and that's a pretty extensive mile, 2 million Israelis living in the United States. Israel has a problem with brain drain, but in the OECD countries, we have one of the lowest immigration rates. And Israel today has surpassed by far, the United States as the fastest growing population among industrialized countries. And we have so many people that we can't keep pace, and we're short between 50 and 100,000 apartments every year, which is part of the great pressure to build in the West Bank, because we can't build enough apartments to keep pace with our population. So that is not our main field that Israel's going to empty out. We're doing very well there.
Let me ask sort of a related question to that. My first brush with Middle Eastern peace was when I was a young correspondent at Newsweek in 1980. And I think I may have told you this story once, where my bureau chief came into my office, and he was one of the great stars at Newsweek, and he was on his way to the Middle East to interview Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat, with Arno de Borgrov.
Right, 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 I was gonna say, Arno de Borgrov.
And so he was all excited about peace in our time, and he was going off there, and he informed me that the chief of correspondence wanted me to go to a shipyard in Poland where there was some labor unrest. The moral of that story is a lot has changed in Europe, but we're still talking, Warsaw Pact has collapsed, Berlin Wall's gone down, and so, but we're still talking about this. The question behind that is related but a little bit different, and that is Israel more secure than it was then? Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the security of the state of Israel is his main priority in these peace negotiations. So is Israel more or less secure than it was, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Not going back to 67, but a little bit more recently. If so, why? If not, why not? And how do these peace negotiations ensure greater security for Israel?
Wow, that is the question, Fred.
Yep.
I'll try to give you as short a possible answer because it's a vast question. A couple years ago, I was having a discussion in the NSC, and someone asked me how would I, as a sort of historian, categorize Israel's security situation? And I said, I'm going to shock you. I said, we are at best in May 1967, and at worst, we're in May 1948. And 1967 was the eve of the Six-Day War, 48 the eve of the Independence War, where Israel had no allies, it had no economy, it had not much weaponry. Why is that? Why are we at best and worst in this type of situation? Because rarely before in Israel's history have Israeli leaders faced such a broad spectrum of monumental threats at the same time. Whether it be the threat of a possible terrorist presence in Sinai, people shooting rockets at Eilat, the breakdown of peace the possible breakdown of peace along the Syrian border, which has been quiet since 1974, insecurity in Jordan. We don't know what's going to happen. Jordan is vital for our security. Our security border is not the Israeli-Jordanian border, it's the Jordanian-Iraqi border. It keeps Iran and Iraq out of our backyard. Among other things, we had the Iranian nuclear program, just a monumental threat, a generational threat, multiple existential threats, not one, but several. Possibility of violence in the West Bank, 100,000 rockets in the hands of Hezbollah in Lebanon, 10,000 in the hands of Hamas in the West Bank. I mean, really, you wake up in the morning and think, how does these really, any prime minister or anybody in the government actually function looking at all this? And I took a deep breath and I said, at the same time, not only are we in the best of times and worst of times in terms of May 48 and May 1967, but right now Israel is in an incalculably better geostrategic economic situation than it's ever been at the same time. So why? All right. We have a peace agreement with Egypt, peace agreement with Jordan that didn't exist in 67, didn't exist in 48. They're not great peace agreements, but they're peace. I mean, we're not fighting one another. We have relations with India, relations to China that didn't exist then. 21 years now we've had relations with India and China, very close relationships. Great relationships with the former Soviet bloc countries, many of them, like Czechoslovakia. Poland is a good example. We have the deepest and one of the deepest and most multifaceted strategic alliances that the United States has ever had with a foreign military power in the post-World War II period. We had that didn't exist in 67, 48. The Israeli economy is flying off the charts. OECD we mentioned, we're rapidly closing the gap per capita income with Western Europe. In terms of innovation, we're number one. The military is very powerful. It's at least as big, twice as big as the British and French armies combined, and very motivated as citizens' army. Just about by any parameter you're going to look at, Israel's a very successful society. So the answer to your question is yes. To both. Is Israel in a terrible situation? Israel's in a great situation? The answer is yes. And we coexist, however, unsteadily. We've recently moved to Tel Aviv, Sally and I, and we go out to the port area, and the food is criminally good, and there's nightlife, and there's culture, and every once in a while you got to stop and say, if we got in the car right now and drove 4 hours, we'd be in downtown Damascus. If we got in the car right now and drove 2 hours, we'd be in Mafraq in Jordan, which is today a refugee camp, second largest city in Jordan. Think about this. It's not as if this is all happening in California or in Scandinavia. It's happening in the middle of all of this upheaval. But people, it's easy to forget that when you're having a great time in downtown Tel Aviv.
Wonderful, wonderful answer. Have time for another question or two? We're just about 5 more minutes, please.
Thanks. Mark Donovan from the Australian Embassy. Thank you, Ambassador, for that interesting discussion. I'm interested in your views on the consequences for Israel and the Palestinians of the failure of Plan A.
Well, it depends on how we manage Plan B. The consequences, if Plan A is a two-state solution with agreed-upon borders and security provisions and mutual recognition and a solution to the refugee problem, all of those things which I think are impossible to achieve right now, but I would be delighted if they were achieved. I want to be very clear about that. The failure could devolve into a situation of unilateral Palestinian statehood leading to sanctions and boycott, which would be very messy. A recrudescence of violence in the West Bank, which would be very unfortunate indeed. Or just a continuation of the status quo. Maybe the Palestinians won't succeed at the UN in the fall. Maybe not. Maybe there'll be no sanctions. Though I spent many years in Jerusalem, prophecy is not my strong point. But I think we have to prepare for every possibility. A couple of years ago, apropos of prophecy, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It's an op-ed, it's a very short one, but I'm very proud of it to this day. It's called The Paradox of Prophecy. And it looks at the book of Jonah in the Bible. It's the shortest book in the Bible. It's a page and a half, the book of Jonah. I should write a book that short. And if those are just to refresh your biblical memory, and then you'll understand why I'm diverting this way. Jonah is told by God to go to the people of Nineveh and say if they don't repent, they will be destroyed. And Jonah internalizes that God has put him in an impossible situation. Why? Because if he goes to Nineveh and says repent, and they don't repent, and the city's destroyed, then he's failed. But if they go to Nineveh and they repent, and he tells them to repent, and they do repent, then 2 years later they're going to come back and say, why did we have to repent? Nothing happened. It's called the paradox of prophecy. Well, the paradox of prophecy is also the paradox of leadership. I go with my Plan B to a bedroom community of Tel Aviv, and I appear in front of an Israeli audience. You guys are easy. The Israeli audience goes crazy. They're saying, let me get this straight. You want to withdraw parts of the West Bank, and you're going to put a missile in my living room. That's what you're going to do. And I say to them, if we don't do Plan B, this is what's liable to happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen, it's liable to happen. We could find ourselves isolated, we can find ourselves sanctioned, we can find our democracy challenged and our Jewish integrity challenged. So I'm placing side by side with their fear of a missile in their living room, and these are the people who have lived through the disengagements of Lebanon and Gaza, so it's not an abstract fear. And I'm telling them that they have to take some very hard measures for Israelis in order to prevent the worst outcomes. I'm now living the paradox of prophecy. I'm in a Jonah-like situation. P.S. Jonah tried to run away from it and ran out to the desert. And God wouldn't let him run away. I'm not having that type of divine intervention right now. But I do feel that it's my duty and my privilege as a citizen of the state to go and appear before an Israeli audiences, as hard as it is, and to make the case for Plan B, because I think that is the way we best ensure our future and even the Palestinians' future.
You know, I think the Book of Jonah is a good place to wrap up.
It's a short one anyway.
Exactly. And sort of, even Bob Kagan doesn't write those shorter books. But let me just say a couple of things in closing. First of all, as always, a conversation with you, Ambassador Oren Michael, is intellectually rich, thought-provoking, yes, also sometimes provocative. You painted, I loved your answer about the best of, sort of Dickinsonian, the best of times, worst of times. And I really want to thank you for taking this time. Thank you for being Ambassador-in-Residence. Salute to Sally. And Adrian, salute to you again for your philanthropic vision and inspiration. You're really making a big difference here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you.